information, advice, and technical support. This webinar series is part of that effort, and you can find out more about the GeneConvene Global Collaborative by visiting fnih.org//GeneConvene. Now, we've also created an online resource, the GeneConvene Virtual Institute, that shares knowledge which we hope will increase the understanding of gene drive and other biocontrol technologies. And we collect, track, organize, and share things like journal articles, media reports, and policy and regulatory documents. We hope this will be a useful resource to anyone interested in genetic biocontrol and gene drive. So please check out the GeneConvene Virtual Institute site, and while you're there, please sign up for the weekly newsletter, which keeps you up to date on the latest developments in this area. Also, you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And we're still looking for a web assistant to develop and maintain the Virtual Institute's digital presence, so please see the site also for further information and applying. This is now the fourth session of a series of 5 on regulations, policy, and governance, and we've had speakers on global and regional regulatory frameworks, and also talking about other scientific disciplines that have done risk assessments on organisms with characteristics that are shared in common with gene drive organisms. This week, our 2 speakers will be talking about how gene drive organisms could pose challenges for existing regulatory approaches, and also how governance of gene drive research and development could be better improved. So now, as always, some housekeeping items. For any technical problems, please contact FNIH Events at the email address you see here. They're monitoring their emails in case you have problems. The first hour of this session will consist of the 2 presentations that I mentioned. At any time during these 2 presentations, if you have any questions, please write them down using the chat function of Zoom, and we'll address them during the question and answer period after the presentations are done. You'll find the chat function at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. This webinar session will end exactly 90 minutes from when we started. If there are any questions left, we'll address them offline, and this webinar is recorded and will be posted at the GeneConvene Virtual Institute site along with all questions and their answers. So now I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers for today. The first one is Dr. Natalie Kofler of Editing Nature. Natalie is a trained molecular biologist who now works at the intersection of technology, ethics, and governance. Fueled by a desire to make science more representative of the communities it's meant to serve, she focuses on improving scientific training and curriculum, cultivating public dialogue and engagement, and creating more just and rigorous decision-making processes to steer responsible development of emerging technologies. Natalie leads curriculum development and is a strategic advisor for the Scientific Citizenship Initiative at Harvard Medical School. She's also the founding director of Editing Nature, which is a global initiative to steer responsible development and deployment of genetic technologies. She teaches environmental ethics and justice at the Center for Biomedical Ethics at Harvard Medical School and is a visiting fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. She received her PhD in cellular, molecular, and medical biosciences and her BSc in human anatomy and cell biology from McGill University. Dr. Jesse Reynolds is a scholar of international environmental policy, particularly as it relates to new technologies. He has extensively researched geoengineering, that is climate engineering, a group of proposed methods to intentionally intervene in Earth systems at large scales in order to counterbalance anthropogenic climate change. Dr. Reynolds' book, The Governance of Solar Geoengineering, Managing Climate Change in the Anthropocene, was recently published by Cambridge University Press. He's also currently exploring the roles of new biotechnologies and artificial intelligence in facilitating sustainability. He is an Emmett Frankel Fellow in Environmental Law and Policy at the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment of the Climate Change and the Environment of the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. We're going to go to Dr. Kofler first, and so I'd like to turn over the webinar to her now. Natalie, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready. Thank you, Hector.
Great, then please proceed. Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to turn on my video quickly so you can see me and see who's talking. And just firstly give thanks to FNIH for hosting me today. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some of the thoughts and recommendations me and my colleagues have been thinking a lot about recently in regards to this really challenging, challenging technology to govern and regulate responsibly. So let me just start screen sharing and then we'll get going. Firstly, I just wanted to introduce myself a little further. Thank you, Hector, for your kind introduction. But what I was thinking about as I was preparing this presentation is how this really, what I'm going to be talking about really relates to sort of the two hats that I wear. And one is as the founder of Editing Nature, where we're trying to develop new ways of thinking about how to sort of collectively govern these technologies, ways that empower local communities, ways that empower diverse perspectives. So we can really make sure that we make the best decisions possible when it comes to a complex technology like a gene drive, which has the capacity to change ecosystems and environments that people live in and depend upon potentially indefinitely. And it also relates to the work I do at the Scientific Citizenship Initiative at Harvard, which is a new role I just joined in September. And there we're really trying to think about how do we create space and curriculum and training that can allow scientists to better engage with other communities and really think about ways to create bidirectional relationships between science and society. And that's also critical to some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. So I do invite you to kind of check out both Editing Nature and the Scientific Citizenship Initiative, because I think there's some interesting work going on there in this space. So firstly, you should also just understand that my stance in regards to gene drives is, quite frankly, I see them as being incredibly exciting as a new potential way to solve some of these really challenging issues that center around public health and environmental conservation and sustainability. But at the same time, I have a really healthy dose of concern and fear if they weren't to be used responsibly. And so that's where I sit. I kind of sit in the middle in that gray zone. It can be uncomfortable at times, but I think it's a place we need to be as we explore this technology. And really what I advocate for is better processes. So not for or against the technology, but really how are we going to decide about that? And that advocacy really centers around this issue of justice. And that's because these are technologies that are designed to impact shared environments, right? Environments that communities depend on, they live within, and they have had and many have lived within for centuries. And for that very reason, it's I think a pretty easy argument to make that those impacted communities should have a right to how these decisions about gene drives and really any genetic modification of an organism that's intended to spread and reproduce in the wild, in uncontained environments. And that's an important point I want to make here. I know this centers around gene drives, but really what we're talking about here is genetic modification of wild species, right? And ways that can be perpetuated in nature. And so there are some forerunners to gene drives we'll discuss today that I think add as good examples and sort of proof of principle and cautionary tales. And so I'm not alone in arguing for this need for justice. Many organizations around the world have called for this need for the engagement of communities and how these decisions are made. So this is the World Health's recent position statement on the evaluation of genetically modified mosquitoes for control of vector diseases. And as they say, communities must be engaged in planning and conducting field trials before any new intervention. And that they also, they need to consider tools for engaging populations as a real priority in the space of genetically modified mosquitoes. The Convention of Biological Diversity at the United Nations, they also have been active in these global discussions on governance of gene drives. And they also say, this is their report of the ad hoc technical group that works on risk assessment for the Cartagena Protocol, which oversees living modified organisms, through which they are trying to currently modify to address gene drive regulation and governance. And again, here is the importance of indigenous peoples and local communities was noticed to ensure free, prior, informed consent and full and effective participation in risk assessment. If we look more domestically to the U.S., and as some of you may know, and it should be noted that the U.S. is not a signatory to the CBD, so they do not have to follow those sort of protocols and guidelines that the UN CBD puts out. So we're doing some more things kind of internally here, and one really great example, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, is the Gene Drives on the Horizons report that came out from the National Academies in 2017, and in which there's an entire chapter dedicated to public engagement and local community input. And here it states that the broad agreement on the importance of engaging affected communities in decision-making about activities involving gene drives, and that engagement cannot be an afterthought. It requires effort, attention, resources, and advanced planning. I agree wholeheartedly. Where the struggle is, though, is that we don't necessarily have regulatory systems, infrastructures that can actually support, early and iterative engagement with impacted communities. And I want to just say before we move on, I think there needs to be special attention to those that would be directly impacted by, say, the release of a gene drive or any GM organism into the wild. Those are the communities that live within those spaces, whose livelihoods and health could be impacted by both intended and unintended consequences. So an example that we can kind of run through to see sort of, okay, how is, say, on the domestic level, at the federal level in the US, are we kind of prepared to be looking at decisions and risk assessment of gene drives? And I think a really example to look at is the recent approval process of the Oxytex genetically modified mosquito. It's labeled and named OX5034. This is a second generation of a technology made by Oxytec, which is not a gene drive. So to be clear, this is not a gene drive, but it is a transgenic mosquito that expresses a self-limiting gene under a TET responsive promoter, meaning it can be turned on and off when in the presence of tetracycline. When the males of this mosquito are released in the millions into the wild, they mate with female wild mosquitoes. They pass on this self-limiting gene to the females, and this particular line of mosquitoes then causes lethality in any of the female offspring. So only males survive, and over time, this causes the population to be suppressed. It also introduces some susceptibility to insecticide regimens to help as well with existing mosquito control initiatives. So in 2019, the Oxytec applied, had its environmental use permit accepted by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in September of 2019. It should also be noted that Oxytec had already filed and had put through an application for an earlier version of this mosquito that causes lethality in all offspring, including males and females. It went through the FDA. It was a long and rigorous process, and in the end, Oxytec rescinded that process, that application, and then put forward this application. When the EUP was accepted, that then opened a 30-day public comment period, and you can see I put a little red asterisk next to that comment. Though the red asterisks denote the times when the public has a chance to be involved in the regulatory process. So a 30-day comment period opened. In that 30 days, the EPA received 31,235 comments. To be clear, many of these comments were repeat comments that were kind of put out in sort of umbrella campaigns. And what ended up happening is they then chose, of those 31,348 comments, to be posted for public view and to be responded to. These comments came from a variety of stakeholders, including NGOs, scientists, a few local community members, but maybe general public members of the public as well. One comment had 25,000, over 25,000 signatures on it. And as the EPA stated in its document that reviews these comments, that's made publicly available, you can look it up on the EPA docket. Most of the comments urged that the agency not permit testing at all or delay testing until more information of OX5034 was available. There were only 56 comments that were in support of issuing the EUP. And one of those comments, for example, was submitted by the chairman of the board of the Florida Keys Mosquito Control Board. And he was also in support of this because the EUP was seeking to have release in Monroe County, Florida, which includes the Florida Keys, as well as Harris County, Texas. And a lot of the opposition was, some was generic, just being generally anti-GMO, but there were other opposition that was more specific. There was the fear of integration and that these mosquitoes could integrate into the wild and then perpetuating genetically modified genes through the wild population. There was the fear of risk to human health and unknown risk to ecosystems. And a lot of them were actually just requesting, some of them were just requesting more time to understand this technology better before release. After the 30-day period closed, the EPA went through its environmental risk assessment and eventually approved the field trial release of these mosquitoes on May 1st in 2020. This is a typo here, but you should also know that 28 days later, so on May 28th, 2020 is when the EPA actually published their environmental risk assessment. So that's important to note because during this entire time, there was no availability for the public or outside experts to review the environmental risk assessment prior to approval of the EUP. What then happened is that it then went, it was under the sort of standards that it still had to be approved by the state board as well as the local Florida Keys board or the Harris County board before field trials could begin. Florida state approved about 6 weeks later, and that didn't engage any public comment period to our knowledge. And then it went basically to the local Florida Keys Mosquito Control Board to then decide yay or nay if this should be allowed or not. They had about a month and a half to kind of go through this. They did host some open public comment periods. They had sort of town hall sort of meetings. They hosted Oxitec to present on the technology. And in the end, they voted, the commissioners voted 4-1 in favor of the field trial release. And so now these mosquitoes are slated for release in the Florida Keys in the summer of 2021. And they will still have to go through a similar process in Texas to get the same approval there. The point I want to make here, and the main thing, is that there really was only a public comment period built into the EPA that does not give any attention to the local concerns or needs. And when it gets to the Florida Keys level or the local mosquito control board, those mandates are locally defined. It's wonky on how you get to decide who's empowered in those decisions. And there's just a lot of work that we can do to broaden that. What I did want to say, though, is there are some things more immediately that we've come up with recommendations that these procedures could be made more rigorous, just in regards to risk assessment. So these are some of the recommendations that me and colleagues at the University of Illinois and North Carolina State have come up with in some recent publications. One is a registry, and this isn't unique to us. There's several groups that have been calling for a registry for gene drive technologies. I think really more broadly, there needs to be a registry for all genetic modification of organisms intended for wild release. And I also think that we can design a registry that can really think about ways that empower local community input and transparency. And that's going to be critical to really make a successful registry. We also think that there needs to be funding for independent research to assess risks. So much of the research that was engaged in the EPA's environmental risk assessment was research either provided by the technology developers themselves. There really wasn't much new nascent research done by outside groups. And we think this needs to be a priority to make sure that we get the comprehensive sort of data that we need to make the right decisions here. And the third thing we think that could be a really low, easy lift, but have a lot of power to change how the system is done is providing and creating an interdisciplinary external advisory board that would sort of oversee the risk assessment process. And this is critical because not only does this ensure then the interdisciplinary nature of this board would ensure sort of comprehensive oversight of what risks are defined as important and how to define those risks, address those risks and study them. And it also is important because risk tolerance varies from person to person. And so we need to make sure that we go beyond just sort of the normal sort of status quo and who's deciding what level of risk is tolerant and what really who is defined what is safe or not. So those are some sort of three straightforward, immediate recommendations to improve and make a more robust risk assessment process. But for the rest of my talk, I wanted to kind of really get further deeper into this idea of how can we think about ensuring that communities where these releases would occur can be empowered and engaged in the decision-making process. And so I'm going to be calling on an opinion piece that I co-authored with Riley Tettenfong. It was published last week in the Boston Globe. as you see, I got kind of got excited by the sparkly arrow that I drew, but I'm here. But I really wanted to highlight Riley because she is just an incredible scholar. She's recently finishing, or she's just finishing her doctorate work at the UC San Diego in communications. She studies indigenous sovereignty and how it relates and really relates to sort of new genetic technologies. So I want to flag her. People need to, if you don't know her already, look her up. And she was just an amazing collaborator in coming up with this piece that I think we're both really proud of. And so if we're going to really think about, okay, how do we really empower and create just and fair systems for communities to be involved in gene drive decision making, I'm going to give you kind of 4 things we have to be thinking about. The first is that we have to expand the definition of what we call an expert. So of course, we need to have geneticists and vector biologists and ecologists and ethicists and policymakers and technologists at the table. That's a given. But we would also argue that a woman who has lost her daughter to dengue is also an expert. Indigenous peoples who have lived on lands for generations are experts in their deep relationship with the land. My grandfather here in the right corner, Dave McCamus, who sadly we lost a few years ago, was a deep naturalist. And if anyone ever wanted to release a gene drive in Northern Ontario, I would say he would have to be at the table. So these are the kinds of people and the kinds of expertise that we need to start thinking about how we can engage and how we can engage early on. This cannot be an afterthought. And it really has to be thinking about, as we're thinking about these technologies and assessing these technologies, are we doing this in collaboration with those facing the challenge, right? And how then can we make sure that those solutions are really going to serve them and not perpetuate continuing and create new challenges? The second thing I want to bring up, and this is a really important point, is this idea of consent. So we are not going to, we agree completely that consent is important. That is why the UN has the prior, and informed consent language within its mandates. It's also why we have IRBs in the United States. And that is because huge atrocities have been played out against particularly already vulnerable people within communities. So I point you in the direction of the Tuskegee trials in Alabama, where in the 1920s, doctors and researchers went down to Tuskegee and basically withheld syphilis treatments to a number of African-American men to be able to sort of watch the progression of their disease and study it. Not only did this put them at risk and cause a huge amount of unnecessary death, it also put their entire families at risk, because many of them, their wives were then also exposed to syphilis. So activities like that, activities in Puerto Rico in the 1950s, when many poor Puerto Rican women were sort of served as guinea pigs in early birth control trials without fully understanding the side effects and without proper oversight. These are histories of human rights violations that really led to the need for consent processes. The issue that we have here, though, is that current oversight of consent is really focused on the individual, right? It's for individual autonomy and sovereignty. What we don't necessarily have in place are consent mechanisms that focus on the communities and the environments that those communities are a part of. And this is something we have to give a lot of consideration to. It also means that consent is just not going to be enough. You just cannot go in and be like, hey, folks in Harris County, Texas, is it okay if we do this or not? Here's what we're going to do. Now you've been informed, let us know. That's just not going to work. This is going to require relationship building early and often. And it needs to require partnerships where these communities are really part of how these decisions are made. And I know these are big asks, but we need to be thinking about this and how we can start integrating this into our regulatory processes. Along those same lines is we have to reckon with history or it repeats. And especially as relationships are built with impacted communities, the histories of those communities have to be acknowledged, have to be discussed, and have to be ensured they aren't made redundant. And so examples of histories that need to be considered is if we're thinking about gene drives in Burkina Faso, there needs to be discussions of imperialism and colonialism and how the legacies of those systems continue to play out. There has to be the acknowledgement of how technologists might be inadvertently continuing those legacies by the way they are designing technologies and deciding upon technologies. And a more local example, these are neighborhoods within Harris County, Texas, where decisions will be made about the Oxitec mosquito release. Thanks to histories of redlining and environmental racism, there are already areas within these counties where, thousands of people live within. This is no less than 10, for example, sewage treatment plants, refineries, factories around the neighborhoods of Harrisburg and Manchester. These neighborhoods are not this way out of coincidence. These are legacies of redlining, legacies of deciding that certain communities should be able to be exposed to pollutants that other communities should not, centered on histories of colonialism and settler colonialism and racism. And so if we don't think about these histories and acknowledge them, not only is it not going to be able to empower communities in the way that they need to be, but it also can create more distrust in communities for science. And that's a real concern for everybody. More broadly, as environmentalists, if we're thinking about releasing into the environment, we need to also do service and acknowledge the histories of the environmental movement. And I'm going to focus here on the United States, but many people are not aware of the intimate sort of relationship between the founding fathers of the American conservation movement and the eugenics movement. So Gifford Pinchot, for example, who was the first head of the U.S. Forestry Department, he was assigned that post by Teddy Roosevelt. He was also on a delegate to the First and Second International Eugenics Congress in 1912 and 1921, and he was a member of the Advisory Council of the American Eugenics Society in the 20s and 30s. Madison Grant, who was the founder of the Bronx Zoo, wrote an instrumental eugenics piece based on pseudoscience called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. It was based on white supremacy and sort of the supremacy of Nordic populations, and it was highly influential in the Immigration Act of 1924. In fact, Hitler wrote him a letter of praise, calling it his Bible, and Roosevelt also praised this book in several of his speeches. Another person who wrote the foreword to his book was Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was on the board of trustees of the American Museum of Natural History and was the head of the New York Zoological Society. And so these men were instrumental in sort of shaping the modern American environmental conservation movement and the protection of land. And it should be noted that those ideals were not separate from their ideals of sort of purity and who should be able to access those lands. And so we have the legacies of that within the environmental movement now, ideas around hierarchy of species, ideas around the pristineness of land, and a total ignorance of sort of the many indigenous populations that lived in the environment prior to colonialists arriving in the US. And then more recently, sort of who can access that land and who gets to enjoy it. And there's huge issues around segregation and issues of who, what races, people of different races are able to actually enjoy the land. So these things have to be considered, or we are just continuing and perpetuating sort of the existing structural injustices. The last one is easy, and I think probably the easiest of all these recommendations. And that's why I don't have anything really, like no picture or visual to add in it. It's really just, for God's sake, put your money where your mouth is, right? So we've been seeing so much discussion about the need for public engagement, the need for empowering local communities. And yet at the same time, we see millions and millions of dollars put into technology development and the regulation and governance of ideas around those technologies, and only a minuscule fraction of those put into support engagement, infrastructure and opportunities. And this is not going to work because these sorts of procedures are incredibly expensive. And not only that, we don't have the infrastructures and the systems to be able to support them right now. So this is going to require a real doubling down by regulatory agents and governments, by technologist developers, by institutions, and by nonprofits to really think about how we can support this in a meaningful way. So those are sort of the four main recommendations that we're thinking a lot about. I was excited to share them with you because they're sort of newer ideas for us. And so we're in this process now of sort of developing them out and thinking about how to start implementing them. So at the end, I'll share my email, and I hope that you can follow up with me with questions or ideas. And so just before I pass on to Jesse, I wanted to just also highlight a publication that we came out with a few years ago that does sort of address some of this, and I think it's worth returning to. So I invite you to look it up and have a read, especially because Jesse's going to be talking about more of the international implications of governance. And really in this piece, what we try to do, and you can see we had multiple authors, it was very much a collective force here. And what we do is we try to integrate the local into the global context of oversight. And so I think there are ways that we can do this, because of course we cannot be looking at the local at the expense of the global implications. Gene drives are going to be spreading across, we have the potential to spread across nation state borders. They need to be also having global oversight. And so we have some ideas there about how these sorts of ideas of empowering local communities could integrate into global coordination and governance of gene drives. So I invite you to look at that science policy piece from 2018 to learn more. So thank you very much for your time. There are my contact info. You can follow me on Twitter. It's just Natalie Kofler. My email address is there as well. And I do invite you to check out our website at www.editingnature.org to learn about some of the things we're thinking about and trying to create. And here's what I think is a cute picture of a rat that I wanted to throw out there before I think we start talking more about maybe invasive species and gene drives on the international level. So I'll pass it over to Jesse now. Thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Natalie. You've really kicked off our thinking on this today, and I expect it'll be a lively question and answer period. I'd like to turn the screen over now to Jesse, who will give his presentation. There you are, Jesse. Please take it away.
Great. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to present. Let me launch my screen here and see if I can shut off my video. There we go. So I'm going to discuss the international governance and politics of gene drives. I'm going to go a little bit beyond the scope. I want to go a little beyond gene drives technologically and a little bit past the public health applications of gene drives and related technologies, and talk about the conservation of biodiversity as well. I think it's useful to think about politics and governance in a historical context. So one way to approach this, how I view the gene drive development, is as the fourth of four generations of modern biotechnology. And that can begin in the 1970s and 80s with recombinant DNA in bacteria being used to make products indoors. And this was fairly controversial, and it led to initially some self-regulation that was later picked up by the US and other national governments. A second generation of biotechnology could be seen as agricultural biotechnology. It's moved out of the laboratory into the outdoors, although agriculture is something of somewhat of a controlled environment. And this was really quite a controversial set of developments in terms of the politics, and these GMO wars, genetically modified organisms, of the 1990s and into the 2000s, is a topic to which I'll return later in the presentation. The third generation of biotechnology might be the intentional release of genetically modified organisms into natural settings, into in situ settings, which began with proposals to use mosquitoes that have been genetically modified to be sterile. But if you use such a modification that has a reproductive disadvantage, that genetic modification is not going to be picked up. So another approach is to confer a genetic modification that gives a reproductive advantage, such as resistance to a disease. In the photo, you can see the American chestnut, which once dominated the eastern United States forest, and a genetically modified chestnut tree is being developed that is resistant to this fungus, which almost wiped out the tree. And likewise, corals could be modified to withstand the warmer ocean waters and greater acidity that's being brought on by greenhouse gases. And then the fourth generation is gene drives. And unlike the previous description, unlike the third generation, this can, as you probably know, drive the genetic modification through a population rapidly, even if it's disadvantageous. And that's the reason that many of the applications that are being considered of gene drives are to eradicate at least a local population of a given species. One possibility that you're probably most familiar with is the eradication of disease vectors, especially mosquitoes. This map is that of malaria incidence, and that shows you, or at least it suggests, some of the underlying international politics and the ethics surrounding malaria eradication. What's perhaps less discussed is the use of gene drives to eradicate invasive animals, invasive species. This is not a cute rat. This is a somewhat unpleasant-looking rat that is an invasive species in New Zealand. And New Zealand, like many other islands, is a biodiversity hotspot. And there, the birds evolved without predatory mammals on the islands, and so they lost their ability to fly, most of them at least. And now that a few predatory mammals have been introduced accidentally by humans, such as rats, stoats, and weasels, these mammals are easily able to destroy the population of flightless birds. And so the government of New Zealand wants to eradicate these harmful alien predators by 2050, and gene drives could contribute to that effort. Natalie mentioned some of the reasons, some of the bases that gene drives and related technologies call for governance. They pose a variety of environmental and physical risks, and also a number of social challenges around, as she emphasized, who decides, who has input, who's consulted, who gives consent. And existing national environmental law is able to regulate many of the environmental and physical risks posed by gene drive organisms, perhaps with modest modification to the administrative regulations. But some of the risks and social challenges are large scale, they're systemic, they're transboundaries, and some degree of international governance will be necessary. So I'd like to turn and provide something of a landscape overview of potential forums for international governance of gene drives and gene drive organisms. First on the list is the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is an international treaty with widespread participation that I'll be talking about for the second half of my presentation. So for now, I'll just leave it here with an asterisk and come back to it in a moment. Second is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is a hybrid intergovernmental, non-governmental body. And at its most recent World Congress, where its members met in 2016, in order to later make a decision on where it stood on gene drive organisms and synthetic biology, which is a related set of technologies, it called for an assessment of the potential impacts of gene drives and synthetic biology on the conservation and sustainable use of biotechnology. The report came out last year. And it's a comprehensive document. If you need a background document on these technologies, this is a good place to start. And at the next Congress of the IUCN, one can expect the body to take a position on gene drives and synthetic biology. That was to occur this year, but it has, of course, been postponed. Third, as Natalie also mentioned, the World Health Organization has developed in 2014 a guidance framework for testing genetically modified mosquitoes, and that is currently being revised. I believe that it should be released shortly. And this month, it has also released a document on the ethics and vector-borne diseases, which touches on, among other things, gene-drive organisms, which there it emphasizes the importance of community engagement, as Natalie mentioned. And she also mentioned the position statement that the World Health Organization drives, and this is a somewhat different passage from that position statement that I wish to highlight, that the World Health Organization calls for all potentially beneficial new technologies to be investigated to determine whether they can further public health, but this must be done in a context of governance in order to ensure that this is done responsibly. Those of you who are curious further about the World Health Organization, I recommend the October 21st GeneConvene video with Marion Law of the World Health Organization, and she can provide further information. Briefly, a few more potential forums for international governance. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services is a relatively new intergovernmental body that is a scientific assessment forum. It produces reports that attempt to synthesize the state of the art and the knowledge. It has an upcoming report on alien species, which are one of the leading drivers of biodiversity loss. It will touch on the potential use of gene drives and other advanced biotechnologies to help conserve biodiversity against such a threat. The UN Environment Program has a project on emerging technologies, and last year it released a report on emerging issues of environmental concern that included a chapter on synthetic biology, re-engineering the environment, which Natalie contributed to. And it too might take further decisions on the matter. There's a pair of conventions, the Biological Weapons Convention and the Environmental Modification Convention, which through different approaches effectively prohibit the use of advanced biotechnologies such as gene-drive organisms for hostile purposes. And finally, if gene-drive organisms were internationally traded, then they could be subject to international trade law. Now I'd like to move on to the Convention on Biological Diversity specifically. For the rest of my participation, I'll dive into some detail. And if you're interested here, also on October 21st, the GeneConvene Virtual Institute video had Wadzi Mandevini from the CBD, and she provides, I suppose, an insider's view of substantial detail about the CBD and gene drives. So the CBD is a framework treaty. It's fairly, it's somewhat vague, and it's oriented towards, among other things, the conservation of biological diversity. As the name implies, it has very widespread participation. So all countries besides the United States are considered bound under international law by its obligations. And it's supported by an infrastructure, by some bodies, such as a secretariat and 2 subsidiary bodies and some ad hoc technical expert groups. And importantly for our purpose are the conferences of parties, where all the countries get together, including the US as a non-participating participant, I suppose you could say, every 2 years to reach decisions that are not legally binding in the international law sense, but carry substantial weight as they represent a consensus of the international community on how to interpret the CBD. And as a framework convention, the CBD is supported by other protocols, which are separate legal agreements that participants in the CBD may ratify. Most important for our sake is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which aims for the safe transboundary transfer, handling, and use of living modified organisms. So these are GMOs that are still alive, and those that could have adverse effects on biodiversity. It has a few. This agreement has a fewer parties than the CBD itself. These are the two that we'll mostly talk about today. There are a couple other agreements within the CBD regime that I'll not talk about. So in terms of the CBD itself, as I implied earlier, its obligations are necessarily somewhat vague. They tend to use qualified language such as should instead of shall, and in the context of a state's ability to comply with a given obligation. But I'd like to highlight a few provisions in particular. First, the principle of precaution is provided in the preamble. This is a guidance for that states should not use the absence of conclusive evidence as a reason to not act in the face of risk of significant or irreversible harm. There's a number of relevant provisions regarding the in situ protection of biodiversity, that is, protecting biodiversity that exists in the wild, including promoting the recovery of threatened species and controlling and eradicating invasive species, obviously areas where gene drives could be relevant. And there's also one provision regarding living modified organisms, GMOs more or less, that arose in part because the CBD was developed during the time of these so-called GMO wars. And in this provision, this is Article 8G, states are obligated to regulate, manage, or control the risks associated with GMOs that could have adverse effects on the conservation of biodiversity, taking into account the risks to human health. So that's important because in this particular provision, the impacts on human health are significant. And the CBD also calls for environmental impact assessment in advance of projects that could pose significant risks to biodiversity. So one can see that this could provide something of a baseline for international governance of gene drives and gene drive organisms. What's happened is that the CBD Conference of Parties have undertaken a number of decisions that indirectly and directly relate to gene drives and gene drive organisms. I'm not going to get into these in too much detail, but go over most of them briefly and then dive into the process behind the most recent one in a bit more detail. This process began in 2010 as the CBD began to look at new and emerging issues, among which may be synthetic biology, up for consideration as such an issue. And this decision and others called for states to apply precaution in the release of synthetic biology organisms or products that result from synthetic biology. This continued into 2012. Calling for states to consider both the positive and negative impacts of synthetic biology. In 2014, the Conference of Parties gave 5 specific actions that states should do before releasing synthetic biology products, such as risk assessment and risk management and and to approve field trials only after such risk assessments have been taken, etc. And this decision also established an ad hoc working group on synthetic biology. 2016 was the first time that gene drives were on the agenda, because this is when CRISPR-based gene drives were first being proposed and researched in the scientific literature. And in advance of this, this became a political issue with green environmental and anti-technology activist organizations calling for a moratorium on research, and on the other hand, dozens of scientists, around 80 or so, calling for research to proceed cautiously. Ultimately, the CBD, back up there a second, ended up merely saying that the previous decision could apply to some gene drive organisms. More recently, in 2018, that's the most recent Conference of Parties, there was a more substantial decision, a decision on synthetic biology that more substantially considered and addressed gene drives, as well as a decision by the meeting of parties to the Cartagena Protocol. And it's this 2018 decision that I will be talking about in a bit more detail. Leading up to this 2018 decision was an escalation in activity by political interests. As in 2016, activist organizations coming from green environmental groups, and by green I mean a bit more, a bit somewhat more extreme, not the centrist environmental organizations, as well as a handful of organizations more oriented towards resisting new and emerging technologies, called for a moratorium. And in this report, produced by one of the leading organizations, they linked gene drives to agriculture, which is somewhat surprising because gene drives aren't really under consideration for agricultural use. But on the other hand, these organizations had previously had some success in the GMO wars, resisting agricultural GMOs. Research scientists, meanwhile, formed a network, the Outreach Network for Gene Drive Research, that included at least one environmental advocacy organization that focuses on biodiversity on islands. And the Royal Society, perhaps the world's most prestigious scientific body, issued a mini report emphasizing the importance of research. And perhaps most interesting is that African countries took a leadership role, and through the African Union's New Partnership for Africa's Development, which is something of a research arm of the African Union, issued a report here on gene drives for malaria control that emphasized the importance of considering gene drives to help eradicate malaria, which is one of the leading causes of death in sub-Saharan Africa. So, with all this political activity, it built up, or it culminated, one could say, in debates over this proposal to call upon parties to take a precautionary approach to either, let's see, get my pointer, with regard to or refrain from the release, including experimental release of gene drive organisms. And refrain from would have implied a moratorium. It would not have been a legally binding moratorium, but it would be something like that. And around this, you can see in the record that countries position themselves along a spectrum of supporting or resisting or being cautious around research, in which countries such as the African group, Argentina, Brazil, India, Indonesia, English-speaking countries such as Australia, Canada, and New Zealand lined up fairly supportive of research, where countries such as Bolivia, Egypt, El Salvador, Japan, Venezuela were more cautious and leaned toward the moratorium. And the European Union tried to broker a compromise, and my reading of the situation is they leaned toward a more precautious position. Regardless, the outcome was not at all like the proposal, and instead it said that research and analysis of gene drives are needed, and to apply a precautionary approach in accordance with the convention, and consider introducing gene drives into the environment only when three conditions are met. One is scientifically sound risk assessment on a case-by-case basis, to have risk management measures in place, and perhaps most interesting to this conversation is, where appropriate, the prior and informed consent of potentially affected indigenous peoples and local communities is sought or obtained. And that last point is worded in a somewhat vague and not necessarily binding manner. So in my last slide, I'd like to briefly reflect upon what I see as the parallels and differences between the current political discourse around gene drive organisms and that surrounding traditional or agricultural GMOs during the 1990s and the 2000s. So on the similarities column, the industrialized countries have largely maintained the same positions that they had before, with continental Europe having a relatively cautious approach toward biotechnology, and the English-speaking developed countries being somewhat more enthusiastic. Second, most of the opponents of gene drive organisms were active in opposing genetically modified organisms in the 1990s and 2000s. As we saw, they use agriculture as a rhetorical connection to those past partial victories. These conversations are playing out at the same forums for international governance, largely the CBD, but to a lesser degree, the IUCN. And finally, a lot of the debate concerns around how to interpret precaution, the precautionary principle as it's embodied in the CBD and in the Cartagena Protocol. Of course, these conversations, these debates have been different. Most importantly, the positions of the developing countries, of some developing countries, particularly those in Africa, are quite different. In the GMO conversations, they tended to follow Europe's position and resist to varying degrees the use of genetically modified crops, whereas as we've seen now, they are largely supporting the research of gene drive, at least for public health purposes. Most GMO opponents from the 1990s and 2000s have been quiet on gene drive organisms. That doesn't contradict my previous point, only to say that a lot of the larger, more centrist environmental organizations that led some of the efforts against agricultural GMOs in the past have been quiet on gene drive organisms. Scientists have also been quite different. A lot of scientists, in retrospect, look at the GMO wars of the 1990s, and I've read more than one sense of regret that they stayed on the sidelines for too long. And the activists ended up framing the issues. Unlike in that case, currently we've seen in the gene drive organism debate, scientists and scientific organizations taking a much more proactive role early on in the discourse. Fourth, the private sector was quite active in pushing for genetically modified crops. They were developing, they were researching, they sought to commercialize them. And that makes sense because they are what an economist would call a private good. They can control, they can keep the benefits to themselves. The farmer who uses the GM seed captures the benefits, whereas gene drives have not seen commercial involvement for the most part because they would be what an economist would call a public good. The benefits are spread across a region, so decision-making there would be undertaken most likely by state and government actors. And finally, GMOs were seen largely as a threat to biodiversity, whereas gene drive organisms have the potential to protect biodiversity, which creates a very different dynamic at the CBD. So I'll leave it there. If you have more interest, I've recently published 2 papers on this topic. There are the links. They're both available at my website and at SSRN. And with that, I will thank Hector and the other organizers, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Jesse. Once again, something for us to really sink our teeth into as far as discussing and thinking. And as I predicted, there's already been a lot of questions that have been posted on chat. So I'm going to just get to them. The first one I'm going to hand over to Natalie. It says to Dr. Kofler, to alleviate local concerns of adverse test results, improve risk assessment, and assert test accountability, would the approval of a federal cleanup fund be helpful?
Yeah, so I was, thank you for that, Stephen. I actually, I was happy to see your question because I've actually just been starting to dig into sort of the mandates for community engagement in cleanups and superfunds by the EPA. So they have the community engagement, I think it's called initiative, which basically has to be part, I believe, of localities deemed superfunds for cleanup from toxic waste and things that have happened to them in the past. So there are some structures there that I think would be really helpful to explore and think about ways that we might build in some of those structures into the regulatory process of these technologies. I would love to chat with you more if you know more about that, because I'm just starting to look at that too. But I saw that as also, yeah, an interesting opportunity. Hector, do you want? I mean, I can see them too. Do you want me to?
Well, actually, I did want to have pose a follow-up question myself, and this went to Jesse, which is that you had mentioned during your talk a couple of other supplementary protocols to Cartagena, one of them being the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur supplementary protocol on liability and redress. And to me, that supplementary protocol does address certain items that would relate to some kind of capability to clean up, because one of the things, at least that has been discussed, is the sort of administrative approach to any kind of damage that's been done. So I was wondering if you're able to comment further on that as it relates to the question that Stephen Panosian wrote to us.
Yeah, gladly. So the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Supplementary Protocol provides calls for states to provide for operator liability in the event of environmental harm resulting from the transboundary movement of living modified organisms. And while that's a smart starting point, perhaps, my sense is it's not necessarily a good fit for gene drives. One challenge is it has that supplementary protocol does not have a large number of countries that participate. I forgot what the number is. It's less than 100, I believe. And also the incentives that gene drives offer and create for both private and state actors are somewhat different in that as I mentioned, there's something of a public good. And I don't mean this in the normative sense of good or bad, but in the economic sense of a non-excludable benefit. So if malaria is eradicated, or then a large group of people will benefit, perhaps not just those that undertake the action. Likewise, if an invasive alien species is eradicated. So one must be careful about the incentives that operator liability would create. But at the same time, we want to ensure that anybody who has been harmed is justly compensated. And for that reason, compensation funds are indeed the right model to look for in the event of environmental or physical harm from the use of gene drive organisms.
Great, thank you. You'd mentioned public goods and private goods in your talk, and we're going to get back to that in a minute. But I'd like next to ask a question of Natalie. This is from Kenoi. Can you provide an example where all four of your recommendations have been followed with respect to gene drives and prior informed consent of affected parties? Would you go with the global or local operational definition of affected parties? There's a couple of questions folded into one, I think, in that one.
Yeah, and I think I wanted, there's a couple other questions in the chat, kind of getting at this sort of idea of global, and I think I wanted to just firstly state, and I should have made this explicit when I started my conversation or my presentation. I made a pretty conscious effort to focus on the United States in this talk. And actually, Jesse and I talked about that beforehand, in part because for several reasons. One, that's where my expertise is. So why talk about stuff I don't know as well about, right? Not that I'm not naive or ignorant to what's going on in other nations. I think there's really important lessons to be learned and examples to look at, which I can get into in a second. But secondly, really, the U.S. is not, as Jesse mentioned and I mentioned, the U.S. is not a signatory to the CBD, so it does not have to follow. I mean, it's an observer in those processes. It does not contribute to those protocols, and it doesn't have to follow what those protocols dictate. And so there's a real critical need here to think about improving the US's ability to look at these technologies. The second thing is that we have these examples in the United States, like the Oxitec mosquito, like the American chestnut tree that is very soon going to be entering the regulatory process. We have these examples happening now that are highlighting the inadequacies of the US regulatory systems. I think that's a great lesson for US policymakers, and it's also a lesson for policymakers in other nations and at an international level to see where these weaknesses are. So that was an intentional bias that I brought to this talk, and I should have been explicit of that, and I'm sorry. So it wasn't in any way overlooking other things happening internationally and in other nations. The global context is important for several reasons. One, we know, for example, that Target Malaria's gene drive mosquito project is probably the most mature gene drive mosquito project in the world. They, as a technology group, have done an incredible amount of work in public engagement and local outreach. They've had funding from the Gates Foundation and Open Phil to put a lot of money towards that. I meant to highlight that when I said put your money where your mouth is, because they put $30 million into their public engagement initiative. So that's important. However, there is a concern when the technology developers themselves are running all public engagement. And so we need, despite the best intentions, we need to also think about independent third bodies that can create those spaces to reduce biases and create a more independent, neutral space. So I think that is important, and there's a conflict of interest issue there that does need to be considered. So I wanted to just say that too, that I think we need to be looking elsewhere to think where things are happening and things to pull on and examples. But at the same time, with what we're seeing in the United States right now is just not okay. And so I think there's a lot that needs to be done domestically as well, considering this is the NIH as well. So that was also why I took that opportunity. To answer Ken's sort of challenging question, no, I have not seen all four of these things been done in any sort of case, which is why I recommended that they all need to be done. So there's been parts of that's been done. I think that there is movements in those directions and an appreciation, but just not far enough. So no, I cannot give a case that I know of where this has happened to the extent that it would need to be, and in an independent, method as well. And in a way, lastly, that is actually informing the regulatory process, right? That it's built into the decision makers in policy and how these policies are made. Does that answer it? Sorry, that was super long-winded.
No, actually, we wanted to give you enough time to.
Yeah, thank you.
We've got plenty of time. So the next question I'm going to queue up is the one from Jason Delborn to Jesse, and this has to do with the topic of public goods that I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And this is Jason saying, "Well, I agree that global gene drives are generally matters of public benefit. Research on self-limiting gene drive organisms, for example, threshold drives, create significant opportunities for application to pest management, including in agriculture. It seems important that we do not ignore the role of agricultural priorities in driving the priorities for gene drive and research and development as we move forward. This also aligns with the history of GMOs, where public good innovations were envisioned, for example, ending world hunger, but most R&D focused on technologies that aligned with commercial interests, such as herbicide-tolerant crops."
Right. So it's good. It's good to hear from Jason, and I generally agree with his sentiment. I hope that my talk did not downplay gene drives future potential in the direction of agriculture, certainly through the use of limiting through limiting mechanisms that could spatially contain the effect of a gene drive, so that it could be used for more controlled agricultural release to fight agricultural pests. I will say though that there still remains a difference in how the products have been developed thus far. I think that the era of agricultural GMOs was largely being driven by private researchers and public bodies researching closely with private organisms, with something of a rhetorical veneer of public good benefits, some of which manifested, some of which didn't. But I think at the heart it was an endeavor geared towards commercialization, whereas gene drive is something of an inverse, in that it's largely being driven by public funding. Still solidly oriented towards classic public goods of public health and environmental protection, with a significant underlying potential towards potential agricultural use, and how to put the ability to alter the technologies so that their benefits and impacts are excludable, effectively transforming them into something more like a private good. And that is indeed something we should keep our eyes open for as we think about regulation.
Can I add to that, Hector?
Sure, go ahead, Natalie.
Yeah, I think Jason brings up a really great point. Hi, Jason. But I agree, and I think the major thing that I hope for, because I am eternal optimist, I think that's the only thing that keeps me going, is that because at least the gene drive space is in the public sphere right now, mainly driven by nonprofit funding. Not to say that there's not private interest as well. I think we have an opportunity that if we can keep this process as open and transparent as possible, that we can avoid what happened with the GMO crop situation. In some way, not maybe entirely, but in some ways. And so that's actually where like the things like these registries come up, and thinking about how we have to shift how we make these decisions. If we can make them open and transparent, then it changes the direction, I think, in some ways. It's more complicated than that, but that's one thing I think I wanted to mention.
Okay. Actually, there's a follow-up question from Ken Oya again to Jason's question, and I'm gonna take it now. It's just Ken says it's just not self-limiting for agriculture, but how do you evaluate or test self-limiting mechanisms? How do we define affected parties with respect to work on localization? With respect to demonstrable effective localization mechanisms, if credibly demonstrated. I guess there's an element of, once again, defining what the affected population is that's coming up here again. I guess that would be to either Jesse or Natalie.
I mean, so I assume I can start it off if you, so we're talking here about sort of localized drives and self-limiting drives, and so technology advances in gene drives to keep them in specific locations. And I think there's another follow-up question kind of talking about that too. I think there's benefit there in that you can maybe start to define who the impacted communities are more clearly. That being said, even in a larger, with a non-limiting drive, like if I would say that where the mosquitoes themselves are being released, those have to be the people that are at the front of the line and thinking about their engagement. But I want to just push back a little bit with, I think Ken had some, if credibly demonstrated. And so credible demonstration of a localized gene drive is likely going to require a field trial in some shape or form. And that's where things get really challenging, because if it doesn't localize in the way they hope that you do, or that organism gets transported out of the area of intended release, you now have a non-localized situation that has to be dealt with. So I think that's a real challenge. And maybe Jesse, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I suppose I'm a bit more sanguine on the matter, assuming the credible demonstration. Just if we just assume that, to the extent that a gene drive organism is demonstrated to have a local impact, it increasingly resembles a typical agricultural GMO for which we have decades of regulatory experience. And so a lot of these additional concerns, both environmental and in terms of social challenges that are particular to gene drive organisms, start to I think, lose their valence.
Yeah, I would just argue, though, that there is still a big difference, because even if it's a localized drive, its intention is to impact wild organisms and species. And so they're still in uncontained environments. There might be some put some limits on that environment in different way, but they're not in a crop field, and they're actually intended to reproduce and spread in the wild. So I think it'll be easier to determine like the locality and who should be engaged more over others and how we decide these things. But from a sort of risk assessment and unintended consequence, there's a huge openness, a possibility that I think isn't when you have a monocultural, crop plot, for example, and their impacts on ecosystems. So it's like a yes and no, I think, in some ways.
Thanks both for your answers to that couple of questions. The next one, I think there are a couple of questions here on a gene drive registry.
Yeah.
So, Moez Khan, I'll start with Moez Khan's question. I love the idea of a registry for gene drive and GMOs. Could you talk more about what this registry would look like? Who will the target audience will be for it? Is it a layman? How will we ensure that the language is appropriate and simple, but at the same time accurate? And how will we advertise the registry amongst stakeholders?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. We've been giving thought to that, and we're starting to build that out with different collaborators, particularly some folks also at the Johns Hopkins Health Security Center as well. The first, and it also applies to another question. I wanted to say the reason that this is important, and again, this goes back to me failing to give you my bias on my focus of the domestic US stuff right now, is that the CBD does have a registry for living modified organisms. However, any release in the United States does not have to actually be registered there. And again, it's not as binding as you would hope it to be. So what we were really picturing was something more US centric in thinking about a registry, and kind of thinking about the idea of the clinicaltrials.gov registry, that already you have to register any clinical trial with US participants or occurring in the United States. And so it first kind of started that really any field trial should have to go through a similar process. And again, I think it should be for gene drives as well as any other genetic modified organism intended for wild release and to spread and reproduce in the wild. So Oxytex mosquito, in my mind, should have to go into this registry too, as would the American chestnut, for example. And what was exciting about it is that then if you kind of start with this idea of a registry, how can you design it for different audiences? And the idea here would still be to hit regulatory agencies and inform regulatory agents, to actually inform technologists and other technologists, as well as to inform the public and local communities. And so we actually are thinking about working with user-centered design professionals to think about how that can be designed for those different audiences. I think it's totally possible. It's just you need to have the intention. And then thinking also about, if you are going to work for these multiple audiences, how can you tailor it in a way that it's still beneficial to those audiences, right? So how can we make it so technologists want to put their info into the registry, maybe before field trial release, which would be ideal, right? Is there ways that this becomes an open source with protections for patent, things like that, but so people can be learning from other technologists and maybe not be, repeating past failures, for example, and improving their own work. And then also thinking about how can we also create it as a tool of accountability? Do you show that are there ways that you can show as a technologist that you've talked with these community members or engaged these processes with community members, and have that as a way that actually builds confidence in communities and builds up public trust in science? And so one possibility, even going further, thinking about does it then modify to being somewhat of like a certification process, like you've clicked all these boxes and now you're kind of certified like focus on environmental social justice as well as technology safety and human health safety, right? So like these are the things we're all thinking about. It's very early, but I think that's what's exciting when you start something like that. You can design it with a lot of heads at the table to have us, try and reduce blind spots and have good intentions that we hopefully can design in.
Thanks, Natalie. Actually, the question that Camilla Beach asked, I think you might have answered in part, because she does mention, the biosafety clearinghouse under the Cartagena Protocol.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've mentioned in your answer already some of the areas where you don't think that that's adequate. I wanted to give you a little bit of more opportunity to say something about that if you wanted to, but also then I wanted to ask Jesse a related question, which is, what would you think would be sort of some of the more appropriate, if not the Cartagena Protocol or the CBD, what might the appropriate venue or place to house such a registry might be if one were established? So I'd like to go to Natalie first, then Jesse after he's had a chance to think about my question.
I mean, I think ideally it would be in the way that clinicaltrials.gov is a regulatory mandated procedure. I ideally could see it being co-sponsored by the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA, which are the three regulatory agencies in the US that would oversee various gene drive or GM organism release. The thing to remember though, like registries obviously are expensive. They require upkeep. They require sustained investment and human investment too of people doing the work. So it needs to be, this can't be sorry, I almost swore. This can't be you can't do it halfway. You have to go, really need to do it right. And so it could also be something where, nonprofits might join in that as well and helping to fund. But I could see it sitting there, and it has to have, I want it to be there in some way so it has the clout and credibility that it would require to be successful, because if people don't use it or it's pointless really, right? So that was my thought. What are your thoughts, Jesse?
Yeah, I generally concur with you, and I'll generalize a little bit that indeed the CBD doesn't seem to be the proper vehicle for it, in part because the biosafety clearinghouse, part of the Cartagena Protocol, one loses not just the US, but about 20 other countries, including some significant countries of significant research activity, such as Canada and Australia. And I also think that there's something to be gained in terms from decentralization, in terms of connecting with local populations. So my sense is a registry that is registries and clearinghouses that are undertaken at the national level, that are in compliance with global norms, principles, or general guidelines or best practices for clearinghouse that could be developed by the CBD or by a professional society or by an ad hoc coalition of academics or researchers. And then one could imagine a clearinghouse of clearinghouses, so to speak, sort of a global network of such clearinghouses, so that one can easily find all the information distributed.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm going to ask a question here now from Delphine Teasy. It's in response to actually Natalie's presentation. In many of these perspectives on public inputs and regulatory processes, in several recent seminars, North American speakers give the example of the U.S. and the Oxitec case in Florida, but it would be worth looking at other experiences in different locations, such as the public consultation example in Burkina Faso, which, Natalie, you mentioned, carried out by the National Biosafety Agency, where they actually went to the villagers living where the genetically modified mosquitoes would be released, or the South Asian experiences with Wolbachia. Is there not a little bit of bias because some of the internal U.S. issues are related to, because of some of the internal U.S. issues related to engagement?
Yeah, there's total bias. I called it out already. No, I really appreciate Delphine bringing this up, and that's sort of what I'm saying is I think there are examples we need to look out in the world that things are being done differently. There's all sorts of examples I can come up with in addition to that. Community-led partnerships, studying, racial inequity and its impacts on health, for example. I mean, there's many examples where you see successful engagement of community members in these decisions, in decisions that impact their health and their well-being, right? The thing that's really important to make note of, and I'll expand on this, is it has to really look like a partnership, and a clear partnership and relationship in that way. If it isn't, community members do not then get empowered in the situation to be able to have the voice that they need and to ensure that the outcomes are things that they are behind and supportive of, to then ensure that we're not increasing structural injustices down the line. And so I think there are great examples where community members are brought into this, where consent is gained from community members, but I want to go further than that. And what I said is that consent is not enough. There has to be clear structures that create true, meaningful, respectful relationships and partnerships with community members from early on. And without that, you risk making things worse. So the EPA example is a perfect example. That ridiculous public comment period where people write in all these things they're concerned about. There's so much opacity of who gets heard and how that gets heated in the environmental risk assessment. That actually creates more distrust. Like when you make this up, oh, we'll bring you in, but we don't actually care and we're not going to listen to you. That's really challenging. And so I think there's examples that we can draw on where we're seeing momentum in more community engagement, but I really want to push it farther to really think about how do community members become partners in technology design and technology decision making, and not sort of an afterthought in these things. And I think the Wolbachia experience is a good one, and Burkina Faso in some ways as well. But again, a lot of that initial engagement was run by Target Malaria, which is great that they did that due diligence, but we need independent bodies also being there to help to inform sort of more neutral and unbiased discussions.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. I think we're probably getting close to the end, but I did want to ask this one question from Claudia Emerson, and it's related to your point that we need to expand the definition of expert.
Mm-hmm.
Key idea that we need to be respectful and inclusive of affected persons' perspectives, and so we must find culturally appropriate ways to discover these perspectives and consider how these views can shape and improve research. That seems to be the point, but that is not the same as expanding the definition of experts, which is an epistemological question that the views of affected communities matters a whole lot and needs to be part of and parcel of the process is primarily a normative issue, not an epistemic one. I worry that introducing the notion of expert into such matters complicates what is already a problematic issue and failure to distinguish between fact and value.
Yeah, Claudia, I think that's, I'm really glad you asked that question. It's really important. And I'm going to agree with you and not agree with you, I think, in some ways. This is a really fine line to walk. And it comes in an example when we think about climate change and we try to bring different experts in the room. And so you're putting someone that's a climate scientist that's representing this, thousands of climate scientists that agree with them next to a climate denier, and we're both calling climate change denier, we're both calling them experts. This is where things get challenging and that blurriness between fact and values. Same with the anti-vaccine movement. So I want to be clear that when I'm talking about expert, I am in no way diminishing the need for truth and fact. But what I am wanting to push is an acknowledgement of other knowledge systems. So one example is traditional ecological knowledge held by indigenous communities that have lived for centuries on certain lands and how they understand those ecosystems and how those ecosystems work. That is expertise that needs to be at the table when we're talking about, say, a coral reef gene drive, right? A coral gene drive. We need oceanic peoples at the table to be able to inform with their expertise how that may or might not work and protect against unintended consequences. So there are places of expertise that do still fill the need, check that box for truth or fact, that are left out. The other thing that's a real tension, and I would love to talk about this further offline, is the fact that, these US regulatory bodies, of course, are mandated to thinking about safety to environmental and human health. Like, that is the mandate, and whether the technology is effective, right? Like, that it's going to do what it's supposed to do. And so there's a tension here in some ways when we think about what other sort of perspectives get to be in the room, right? So if you have an organic farmer whose livelihood is going to be impacted by the release of an Oxytec Diamondback moth, and it gets into his crops, and now he can't be organic, that's truth and that's fact. And that still needs to be at the table. And those are sort of economic and social dimensions that can still be highly scientifically rigorous and truth and fact, that still are often not mandated or allowed into the regulatory process decision-making space. So again, I think as a scientist, I am in no way trying to diminish the need for truth and fact, but I think we can still do it in a way that's safe and encompassing, that allows us to come to better decisions.
Thank you. As I guess this is one of the more lively discussions that we've had over the last several webinars, but I do have to end this webinar. I want to assure people that their questions on the chat have been captured, and we're going to address them online when it's been posted. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank Natalie and Jesse for their participation, and then hope that you will be able. There you go. There's your applause. Sorry. I'd like to then talk about bring your attention to next week. Actually, 2 weeks from now, we're going to take another break. So the next one will be on December 2nd, and actually. Jesse mentioned this in his talk, and that is that is for the requirement for an environmental impact assessment of gene drive projects, which is becoming an issue, I think, and a growing requirement, especially based on what Jesse had mentioned about the CBD. So for that session, we'll have two speakers, Dr. Willie Tanui of Environmental Health and Safety Consultancy Limited, and Catherine Gatto-Walton of the Social Practice Forum, and that we'll be talking about this issue. And so I invite you to join us then. Again, it's on December 2nd, and we look forward to having you online with us at that time.